Welcome to Why Knowledge Matters. Welcome. In this episode, Professor Liz Jackson from the Education University of Hong Kong joins me to reflect on her book, Beyond Virtue, The Politics of Educating Emotions. Welcome, Liz. Really nice to have you back.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for hosting me today, and great to see you again.
The book explores how emotion intersect between social life and education. It really asks how one can educate emotions in education and on what empirical and moral grounds for the individual and society at large through an interdisciplinary lens. Most importantly, in my view, you problematize at first sight commonsensical concepts such as happiness in chapter 4, caring in chapter 5. However, before we dive into the details of the book, what made you want to write the book Beyond Virtue in the first place, and where did you start, especially given the scope and nature of your study?
Oh, well, yeah, thanks so much for that question. So it does have an interesting sort of heritage in terms of my own thinking, because I never did anything in psychology before. I always did philosophy of education. So in the first place, I was motivated by my experiences teaching as a teacher in cross-cultural settings to do the research to write the book. So I've been in Hong Kong for almost 10 years now. And when I first got here, I noticed some challenges with my teaching. So in the United States, we try to be what we call very student-centered. We try to be very happy and positive. People talk about how good it is to be happy in education. So what does that mean in terms of practice? It means students and teachers would be smiling at each other. Students would feel very free to ask questions, to offer their opinions, maybe even a little bit informal. And this has been a trend in education in the States and in Western countries to be more informal and more chatty and more like friends or family members and very warm relations. But I noticed this didn't really work in Hong Kong. And not only did it not work, but it actually failed and went the wrong direction. So I found the more that I tried to encourage my students by showing them I liked them, that I was happy and comfortable, I wanted them to succeed, I cared about them, being a little bit lighthearted, focusing on the students themselves. It did the opposite of what I wanted it to do. The students would actually become more serious. And over time, I realized that in Hong Kong, being successful in education is associated with working hard, being disciplined, and being serious. Actually, being happy in Hong Kong doesn't mean smiling in this really big way that Americans smile. So what happened was this negative spiral would occur, and they would become embarrassed by my behavior. So I would be trying to encourage them to be more happy, be more informal, and this would cause them to become more embarrassed. They would become more serious because they knew that I wasn't happy with them and I wanted them to change. So they were just trying to be the best students they could to show they cared about me by being more and more serious. So both of us would just feel more and more anguish. And I realized that the way that we understood learning and being thoughtful and caring in education actually had different behaviors and different emotions around it. And so once I realized this was happening, it really blew my mind. I had actually taught in classes about McDonald's in Hong Kong. And when McDonald's first came to Hong Kong, it had a motto, it has a global motto for its training. So it says service with a smile. And actually people have done research about this saying in Hong Kong, that's not appropriate because smiling is seen as not being caring and serious. It's seen as being sort of unprofessional and uncaring. So they had to throw that away when they moved to Hong Kong originally. So the next step for me was realizing, okay, this is my experience coming to Hong Kong, originally from the US, but students like mine in Hong Kong They're actually in schools all over the world. They're in high schools, they're in primary schools, they're in universities in Canada, in Europe, in Australia, the United States. And I've noticed since I've moved to Hong Kong that my colleagues from Western countries, they're always asking me, how do I deal with these shy, passive, quiet Asian students? And I started realizing that I'd missed the points, but that they were also missing the points. These weren't shy or passive students, actually. They just had a totally different orientation towards showing caring, showing appropriate relationship and education. So blaming them for not being smiling or opinionated totally missed the points. They were doing everything that they believed was appropriate to do in an education setting. At the same time I started thinking about writing this book, I also had some personal things happening in my life at the same time. So I was getting divorced around the same time. And in that process, I saw a counselor and I started realizing the way that emotions impact everything about the way we relate to others. And I'd never really studied psychology before writing this book. I also realized that cultural differences are one thing, but there's also differences across gender, that women have certain challenges they face in relationships and in professional settings, which tend to be different from the challenges that men face in terms of being arrogant or assertive or confident or something like this. So my goal was to intersect a political view of emotions in social life and public life with cultural view and with sociological view and apply that in education. So this definitely was, you're right, it was a Herculean task and it evolved over time quite a bit. So in the first place, I think my own perspective, I was informed by people who did some really important work in some of the key areas related to my book. So Megan Bowler on power and politics and education. John Christensen has written several books on the theories behind psychological views of emotions and virtues. And Sarah Ahmed has written a lot about gender, race, and emotions. But even with these scholars coming before me, it actually felt like I was doing a whole new PhD to do the research for this book. But at the same time, it was really interesting to me because it was a very complicated challenge for me to understand how do psychological views intersect and connect with these philosophical views? Because in real life, we have all of these perspectives which relate to psychology, moral philosophy, sociology, and real life is complicated. So it does require diving into something complex. In reality, we can try to keep things simple. We can just try to teach students to be resilient or to be happy, but people have been discussing this for centuries. They've been discussing this, and a lot of what they've been discussing has been not really working, and I think that's because the view does need to be a bit more complicated. So it's been a really wonderful exploration for me. And now with COVID-19, a lot of us are thinking more about our emotions and well-being in relation to work, life, and education. And I did the research and wrote the book before that, before COVID-19. But that's another impetus. I hope people can learn from this book and find it worthwhile.
Well, while reading your book, I could really feel and see how you were able to connect, the reality. And now, obviously, that you tell me that you actually went through those experiences and your scholarship, obviously, that you did and further explored many scholars in this area. You say that emotional intelligence and positive psychologies are somehow consequentialist in nature since functional. Do you think that the deontological approach, if you think through the consequences, is more appropriate than a consequentialist view if we think how to educate emotions in school? And just as an aside, can you maybe just give and introduce the consequentialist view and what deontology is and how the two differ? And then maybe just compare the two to virtue ethics, because they're very important in the sense that the first two they are, in a sense, they're empirical, and the other ones are more non-empirical. So there is obviously there also a problem, because we can really quantify it in a way that is possible in the first two.
Yes, thank you. I'm so impressed and delighted that you read the book so closely. And so these chapters were quite dense chapters, I think, because the second and the third chapter, they're really focused on these theoretical issues and all about what is like empirically true, what is idealistic, what do we understand about how people are, versus do we want our theories to mirror reality or not? So starting with psychology in education. So psychology is very popular because it's seen as the science of the mind, and it's valued because it's seen as really empirically based. So educational psychologists are the people who ask, how can we get students to think better, to focus more, to feel more ready to learn, and so on. So they're really focused on improving education. So to do that, they have to say that they have empirical data to back up their views. And so in that sense, psychological perspectives are what I would describe as consequentialist or functional, because it really serves a very specific purpose. And among the psychologists, the value of the theories is actually related to, does this reflect reality? Does this actually lead to the improvement that we're seeking? On the other hand, they're not really asking questions about the morality of education, in the sense that, can we help the student make their mind more ready to do a good job in a test? They're not really asking, is it moral for students to take tests? But they're just assuming that, right? And every theory, so I overview all of these different psychological and moral philosophy views. So all of them have their limitations. That's how theories work, is there's certain things they want to do, and there's certain things they frankly don't want to do. Psychologists, they don't have a PhD in moral philosophy, so that's not what they're doing. So they're focused on how to help students be successful, and they're usually looking at a very mainstream view about that. So for them, to do well in tests is a goal. It's not a moral evaluation. So in this context, coming from a philosophical background, I am more attracted to what I describe as a deontological view, which really asks if what is happening at every moment is a good or bad thing, right? So is it a good thing? There's different variations of deontology, but we can ask the question, if students need to practice focusing all of the time to do well in tests, is it good to ask students to focus to do well in tests? And is doing well on tests something that students should learn how to do, that psychologists should be asking people to do, and so on? So a consequentialist that's from a philosophical background, they can reply to this. They can say, well, helping students to do well on tests could help them achieve more in society. It could help create a level playing field. So you can find good reasons, good moral reasons for focusing on well-being in order to do well on tests, for example. But another issue I have with consequentialism, which comes out a lot in the examination of the psychological interventions and projects, is that it's not always, we don't always know the consequences of all our actions. In education, things are very messy and complicated. There's so many factors. So it's not like doing a controlled experiment in education. And then when you think about the relationship between schools and societies, we don't really know the consequences. Some of the consequences we also know can be negative. So for example, we know that there can be effects of doing well on tests that could be negative for students, actually, that could actually not be beneficial to them. So we can show that there's some good consequences, but this isn't always the case for every student. And this is the difference between a laboratory experiment versus real life, where we have to think a bit more broadly about the purpose of education in society. So I'm speaking generally here. The psychologists tend to say that things work in education when it's a pretty complicated domain, and they're not really critiquing what it is they're working toward. A consequentialist will think about what we're working toward, but if you were a moral consequentialist looking at education, you probably wouldn't be. I mean, you could say, students should do well on tests, but you'd probably be thinking about other things like for example, students can do better in schools and there can be more equality in schools if there's more resources and funding and higher quality teachers and things like that. So the tests are just one part of that equation. So the deontologist here would ask, what is the best interest of young people for each individual to be in a school system that does not lead to the same outcomes for all, and those sorts of more critical questions, which a lot of people in philosophy of education focus more on those kinds of questions. Now, virtue ethics has a totally different view about morality. So the deontologist says, is something the right thing to do? Consequentialist says, judged by the consequences. Virtue ethicists will focus on the goal of always becoming a better person. And so in education, the question is, how can education help a person to become a better person, to develop better habits, to have a better alignment? And I'd also say virtue ethics has been very popular in relation to education for well-being because they're focused on the connection between our emotions and what we do. So a deontologist would say, you should never tell a lie, but it doesn't matter how you feel about it, but never tell a lie. For virtue ethicists, they set aside some of the questions that consequentialists and deontologists have focused on to consider how to become a better person in the way that emotions and morality are supposed to link together. However, they know that in reality, they don't always link together. Sometimes you do the right thing, but you actually don't feel good about it. You don't feel the right feeling. So for this reason, they say it's very idealistic. But for a virtue ethicist, this isn't really a problem because they say you're never going to be perfect. But the point is, throughout your entire life, you're striving, and that's a good thing, that you can always grow and you can always improve. So for that reason as well, people see it as really ideal for moral education because the point isn't to focus on not being perfect or ideal, but to always be trying to practice and to get a little better as a person.
What is interesting is you also elaborate on cases like Gandhi, Mandela, and King, and we will go a little bit more in depth in your chapter on anger. I'm curious about, and I think this is a point that we usually don't teach, but I think it is very essential, especially, I guess, for you as a philosopher, existentialism. You seem to indicate that we need more of this in our schools to ask, who am I? And acknowledge negative emotions of being a critical part of being human. And you elaborate, and or we should elaborate with students why it is they feel this way.
Yeah, so existentialism is not usually seen as a particularly moral view in Western philosophy. And, for me, with my background in philosophy of education, actually, it is one of my weaker points. Like before research for this book, I didn't know much about psychology or about existentialism. But what I found really interesting, the more I started thinking about it in relation to morality and the question of what's the implications of this view for education, is I actually found some parallels between existentialism and some religious views, particularly some Christian views, and some Buddhist and Taoist views when I was doing the research about the question of how it connects to education for emotional development. So in all these views, in existentialism, one of the main keys, I think, is that people realize that they're connected to others around them, that they're actually a part of a larger world and larger processes, and not singular and independent and autonomous. So, for most psychological theories, they focus on individuals and how individuals, that's sort of the measurement unit is the outcome for an individual. Likewise, consequentialism, deontology, virtue ethics, they're actually focused more on is a person a good person or not? And there tends to be a focus on the individual. And I think here that's a really big difference, is that we're caught up in the politics of the social world. We can't change and control that world. We can't separate ourselves and live apart from that world. And to me, that's a really interesting point in relation to emotional experiences and having mixed feelings, is that mixed feelings are a part of life, and we can't simply, it's unhealthy to just say, okay, that's the world over there, but I'm going to be a good person over here. I mean, sometimes that can work, but that's not always the absolute answer. And because we're a part of the world, we have to kind of let our feelings and our experiences flow through us, and we have to accept them to some extent, because it would be unhealthy to repress them. So it's one thing to say, okay, I have a distance from these social problems, I'm my own person. But there are cases, there are experiences where you're affected by the world, and you shouldn't repress those experiences. So in relation to education, my fear is that schools are telling students, don't become upset. At all costs, don't be angry or sad or overwhelmed by emotions, like, because that's just not good for learning. That's just not constructive for teaching and learning. But we're humans, and sometimes we have these feelings, and children, of course, are going to have these feelings. So from these views, it's not morally healthy for a well-aligned personality and relationships around the world around you to have no feelings or to be in total control of your feelings. And it shows that sometimes there's nothing wrong about being sad or angry. And the problem in education is that the goal of teachers is to have students sit still and learn math sometimes. But you know, sometimes you have a bad day, and I think existentialism and these other views are more sort of psychologically healthy in helping us realize, okay, sometimes we're affected by the world around us, and that's part of being in the world. We can't escape the world. Most of us don't have spaceships to go to outer space when the world brings us problems. So it's okay to respond to those problems.
Chapter 4 on happiness, and obviously everyone wants to be happy, and yet, and I think rightly so, according to you, you problematize it, and because you say it can lead to disengagement and basically denial of reality. But if we see reality as it is, we can actually take advantage of it in the long term to find meaning. Realistic and pragmatic approach. You conclude unhappiness can be as reasonable as happiness. Can you further explain what you mean by this?
Yes. So the first few chapters, they focus more on those theoretical analyses. And then starting with this chapter, I start spinning it to focus, okay, what is an example of a feeling that's very popular? So happiness, everyone wants to be happy, like you said, and do a deconstruction of them. So in the case of happiness, many people see happiness as a goal, and I was very influenced by Nell Nodding's famous work on happiness and education here, which influenced a lot of people. And her argument was basically we should encourage students to be happy, to feel happy, and to cultivate happiness through education. And part of that is students are happy while they're learning. However, it's an interesting concept, and I guess part of the point is it's a response to the notion that education should be like a kind of torture. So saying, okay, maybe education should actually be a very pleasant experience. But the problem is that, like you said, people who are happy all the time, no matter what, it's not really a good thing when bad things can be happening to you, and bad things happen sometimes. So a psychologist will not say that you should be happy all the time. That's seen as sort of pathological to always be happy. Happy people might not be very careful people because it's associated with being carefree. And so in relation to education and the work of teachers in schools, um, not to be sort of I feel like sometimes in this book I'm a little bit depressing, but I do feel like someone needs to mention, in reality, children do suffer from negative experiences. So children do all of the things that make you or me unhappy. Young people also experience them, and they experience them in relation to us. Personally, students may witness bad things around them. A lot of children suffer from witnessing abuse of people in their family or of themselves. They could just be unhappy about global climate change or politics. A lot of people are unhappy about those things right now. So there would be something wrong with them if they were not unhappy about these issues. So the idea that teachers should have the idea that happiness is always a good thing, this could actually be detrimental to some young people when they're facing and experiencing bad things in the world. So in this case, unhappiness can be useful and valuable and valid, and it's not helpful to discourage unhappiness, because sometimes it can also be useful in a healthy response to seeing negative things. Another problem, if we think that happiness is the best thing and you should always feel happy, is that students can learn to hide their unhappiness. And this is something that causes a lot of people see counselors and therapists when they're adults, because when they were young people, their parents and their teachers did not allow them to ever be unhappy, and they actually hide their unhappiness. So this is a very unhealthy reaction, and it's something that people overlook when the goal is always happiness. So a teacher might not really realize they're doing this, but if they are unhappy with students who are unhappy, if they punish students for being unhappy, or say it's not acceptable to be unhappy, that can actually lead to short-term and long-term harms for students to learn that lesson that unhappiness is a bad thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know today that, it can lead to severe medical conditions when we actually, keep our emotions, within ourselves. So it's this is really important. And usually we always obviously we try to sell something because we wanna adjust to the situation. But I think, given that schools, at least, they attempt to be, to some extent, safe spaces where people can strive and learn, it might be very appropriate that we actually give space and use it as a fuel to some extent for learning. In your chapter 5, Caring, Compassion, and Altruism, you're very clear. And I think, again, I think you do a really good job, because you really demonstrate that it can be self-serving, basically a means to an end. And you also problematize it in terms of gender, what is expected, for example, of girls, and what is expected, from boys, and both sides are harmed. You conclude, and I think this is really key, and it goes through the book, which you do such a good job, that there is this moral ambiguity, and which is, according to you, is actually a good place to start, since life is ultimately beyond black and white, even though today, obviously, the algorithm, it seems that there is no really gray in between. So if we teach such concepts such as caring, compassion, and altruism, you say we have to deeply engage students in them regarding the pros and cons.
Yes, I think that's right. And thanks so much for complimenting the book. I'm glad that those points came through. So it's a funny thing, because we tend to see caring and compassion, especially in Western societies, we tend to see them as always good and unproblematically good. And then, of course, they're unproblematically good in education. But in other views, uh, these are seen sort of more as duties, which can also be problematic. From a Confucian view, there can be certain caring relations that are more like duties, and we tend to see them as very sort of fluffy and warm and fuzzy concepts in Western world. And empathy also can be used to manipulate and to control. Many people use empathy to manipulate and control people. So it's not merely a good thing. It has sort of both sides. It's a double-edged sword. And the next level of this, so I know the argument's quite complicated throughout, but I have fun with that. Is that the qualities are gendered. Like you said, boys are harmed if they're not encouraged to be caring, and sometimes girls are pressured to be caring so much that they don't think about themselves, and that becomes a psychological problem for girls as they get older. So there are risks here. So in education, the point should not just be the same thing with happiness, right? Happiness is, it should not be the case that we say happiness is good, unhappiness is bad. Caring is good, being uncaring is bad. The right answers are not given beforehand. It does depend on the situation. And that would be part of being a good person. Actually, from a virtue ethics view, they would say that the situation matters. Confucianism is very focused on situations. And a psychologist will say your feelings should have to do with what you're responding to in the world around you. So we just don't force ourselves to feel what we call positive feelings all the time, no matter what.
Chapter 6 on gratitude. Again, seems a concept very commonsensical, absolutely necessary, and if you don't have it, then there's definitely a problem no matter what, because you should be grateful to be alive, of course. But you say here it can be a source that comes from negative feelings, for example, shame. Research shows that practicing gratitude has positive effects, but you're also clear that such methods, for example, self-reports, have their limitations. Can you further elaborate on the limitations such methods and methodology have?
So like you said, with the case of gratitude, we do tend to assume it's a good thing, and many people have been very focused on this point. But it's interesting in cross-cultural studies, people in UK feel more shame with gratitude than people in America. So this is a problem where if we take an American view and try to apply it in UK, in where I live in Hong Kong, it can actually be not as helpful as you think it's going to be. So that's why the cross-cultural part is important. And then there's a larger issue, a common problem with educational research in this domain. And there's been a lot of focus on gratitude here, but I also have observed this in some other areas, especially, I was mentioning before that education psychology is influential because it's about what works and it promises to achieve something good. So as a researcher, I want to improve things. All researchers want to have a positive impact. And we apply for grants to say we will improve things. So we'll say, students will do better on tests, they'll be more sort of engaged civically, or that they'll have better well-being. But it's actually very hard to measure this. Having some help here from my cat. So what happens in most interventions and projects, what happens is first the teacher or the expert tells the students that gratitude is good. So if we take the case of gratitude, it tells the students gratitude is a good thing. Here's how we develop gratitude. Here are the benefits of having gratitude, and here's how we can show gratitude. Then later, a researcher comes in and they ask the students, did you learn about gratitude? Do you have gratitude now? What do you think about gratitude? So to me, these kinds of research studies are very problematic because I don't know why they do these studies. Of course, the students, like if you're learning math or science or any subject, of course, the students are going to say that they learned something, and they're going to explain what they learned. It's just like learning in any area. So there's an assumption in the study that this learning is going to stick. So there's the suggestion in a lot of research that this is going to lead to long-term negative impacts because other research shows that people who have more happiness or gratitude, et cetera, that this is associated with other character traits. The problem is that you can't assume that there's a long-term impact based on one intervention. So we teach very similar math and grammar to students every year for 12 years. We don't assume that they're going to internalize the first time everything we tell them when students are taking in so much information all the time. So there's no research showing that single interventions are going to have a significant impact apart from being a single school lesson. And I make this point, especially with gratitude, but I think that's important to consider with all of this well-being research is researchers want to make the argument that there's a long-term positive impact, but actually we don't, no one's studying that. No one's going up to those students 20 years later and saying, is your life better because of one intervention? And here I'm being a little bit, I'm simplifying matters a little bit, but this is a big problem because teachers, we all want to improve things. And sometimes I think we become a little too optimistic, and researchers do themselves. And then educators and politicians also say, okay, we'll do what they say, this works, but it actually doesn't work.
You said that resilience is not a moral, emotional virtue. Resilience is often used to rationalize cuts in education, for example, big classroom sizes. More importantly, it is promoted for individual gains, but not for societal gains, which is, according to you, problematic. Can you further elaborate on that?
Yeah, so this is a good point, and I think you're right. That's that part of the aim of this chapter is not to point out is simply to point out that we can't always assume that there's cure-alls. And so something really strange has happened with resilience where it's been taken up. So like I mentioned with gratitude, there's these interventions, they don't necessarily work. On the other hand, there's been these really strange cases. One case in Canada where a politician says, we're going to take away resources from schools in order to build their resilience. And this is quite strange. This is sort of, to me, I feel like this is abusing the concept because the whole point of resilience is that the more resources you have in terms of your own resources, like your mental and physical well-being, your family resources, your school resources, that all that makes you better prepared for challenges. So the idea that a school would take away resources in order, it's basically to test people's resiliency. I think it's quite backwards, and it's basically just challenging people and making kind of a moral argument that to me doesn't really make sense. And I think most educators were quite shocked, because if we want students to learn, the moral thing to do is to provide more resources if we want them to learn. It sounded like they wanted to save money and they tried to co-opt the moral focus on resiliency in order to do so.
You mentioned mindful yoga, and you say that some of these streams promote ethical egoism. Can you further elaborate why you think that this is problematic?
Yeah, so I think you're right, and I do focusing on the point that these things aren't cure-alls. I kind of showed the negative side of yoga. So my dirty secret is that I do yoga. I did yoga yesterday, and I do some. I used to do some meditation for some period of time, and so I do see positive benefits to it. But one fear that people have around the promotion of yoga, especially to solve social problems. So this is the thing I would say is it might be good for all of us to develop our resilience, or it might be good for, I wouldn't say all of us, it might be good for many people to develop their resilience. But the problem is when it's taken as something that's going to help us fix problems. And this goes back somewhat to what I was mentioning about existentialism and there's different views in Buddhism around this too when it comes to the relationship between oneself and the world. Because on the one hand, these things can help you step back from yourself and to step back from the world and see things in a broader view. That's my personal experience, and I think that's experience a lot of people have. And these techniques become popular because then people feel refreshed afterwards. I know I feel refreshed afterwards. and you see things in a different perspective. You sort of feel enlightened in a way, so that can be quite a good thing. Um, but the problem is, like I mentioned before, it's not necessarily healthy to just deal with, if you're really facing problems in the world, to just say, okay, I need to do some yoga or I need to meditate. That might not solve the problem. It might solve the problem in some cases if the problem is kind of emotional, or if there is no way to change the problem in reality. But the risk is, if we take these ideas into an educational space, we're also encouraging students to just look within themselves and just feel good themselves and put aside the challenges that they're facing. So I wrote about this in the same space that I wrote about the resiliency, because one of the messages in the resilience discourse is, okay, life is stressful. Maybe you don't have the best school. Maybe they deliberately focus these interventions on working with disadvantaged students and poor students. And they say, just set aside your personal problems and your educational frustration and just relax a little bit. So for some people, this can be a good thing, but for some people, it doesn't fix the problems. So that's why I say it's not really a cure-all. And if we want to encourage students to be civic-minded, it doesn't work for everyone. So you're right. And when I was talking about yoga, I did really focus on this one side of things, this ethical egoism, which is I just want to feel good, and as long as I feel good, then everything's okay. But there are, of course, people that do people that are Buddhists and that do meditation and yoga religiously or on a regular basis, who are focused on making positive social change. So that's one side of it too. But what's interesting is when they focus on interventions in schools, they don't focus on that social part, on that creating positive social change. They tend to focus only on you feeling better. And actually, this doesn't work for all students. It works for some students, but it doesn't work for all students. For some students, it's actually a negative impact on them. It actually makes them feel more stressed out if they feel like they're supposed to feel a different way and they can't make themselves feel a different way or something like that. So I know I've really gotten a lot of yoga and meditation myself, but some people I know are really not comfortable with that. So if you can imagine everyone in a school has to do yoga, it's not going to work for everybody.
In chapter 8, you discuss vulnerability, courage, and grit. And you say that minority groups experience more stress in classroom than other because they have to defend very often themselves and the position. Therefore, you suggest it is advisable to teach more non-stream things to give more privileged groups the opportunity to be vulnerable. And I think this is really important, especially even the playing field. Therefore, epistemic vulnerability can give birth to a more equitable school environment. Can you further elaborate on your point?
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that you agree with me that this is an important point. So this is a really tricky situation, and it's a situation I've thought about in the context of a classroom where people are diverse. But in this book, I also try to think about it more broadly in terms of what is a school like or what is a university like. So there are powerful actors in society, the principal of a school or the president of a university. And I want to suggest that vulnerability is not about a person, but about an institution. And if an institution is strong, then those powerful people will learn from their underlings, from everybody. And those ordinary people in the organization, the normal teacher, the normal student, those people will feel empowered to also discuss their challenges, their experiences of the organization. So the first step here is to think about resilience or vulnerability within an organization as a social phenomenon and not a personal phenomenon. And over time, I've come to think that this this makes more sense. I mean, I can think about this with COVID today, right? We have to think more collectively if there's a contagion. And I think these ideas have always also crept up on me living in Hong Kong for as long as I've lived here, because there is this very strong tendency in Western philosophy and Western psychology to individualize things, to say it's a person who has this trait or who doesn't have this trait. But we're always relating to other people. None of these traits exist without relationships. I can't be vulnerable without there being people who aren't vulnerable, even from an individual view. So there's always a connection there. So what I would like to encourage here is, if we think about a community, the community is only as strong as our weakest link. And I think that this gives a sense of social responsibility. So I'm not just responsible for my own well-being, but I'm in a community, and each of us has vulnerabilities. Everyone has vulnerabilities, right? We're humans. We can get flus, we can get COVID, we get hungry, we get tired, and we're all connected to each other. So being strong and having courage then doesn't mean that I just look after myself. It also means that I have a positive impact on other people around me.
This is something that I think it is always a personal challenge, because you, as you just said, you make yourself vulnerable, and it's always a challenge no matter what, to at times listen to other people's very different views, which we can't really differentiate, our way we think and value things in ourselves. So it's very hard, but it's extremely enriching, and I think also helpful. And it's really where real learning can take place, and where else than university. um, the chapter 8, you have vulnerability, courage, and grit, and I want to quickly touch on grit. You say that we must teach that failures and challenges can be problematic and ought to be explored in schools, addressing the culture of Silicon Valley, basically, and how failure are emphasized as the engine to success. Therefore, grit, etc., must be critically assessed and context-based, especially if you see education as a moral endeavor. Therefore, we cannot endorse such concepts simply as a silver bullet.
Yeah, absolutely. We learn from problems, but that doesn't mean that we should be exposed to more problems just to learn from them. So as we were discussing before, the case of the school in Canada where they increased class sizes, it's like they were encouraging challenges and failures in order to develop, they said resiliency, but they could also say grit. So this is another case where grit can be, if it's not contextualized, if it's not applied in a very careful and moral way, it can just be used as a way to excuse failures that is not helpful. So of course it can be helpful to deal with failures in a constructive way, to accept failures in a certain way. So grit can be useful, but that doesn't make failures good things. So there's a risk there that failures are treated as good things. I mean, some failure could be natural, some can be good, but also a failure might not be an individual's failing either in some cases. And this is another worry with grit, is it going to individualizes it. So it says, okay, you failed the test, so you need more grits to be strong and be a cowboy and do a better job on the test in the next setting. But it doesn't really help people to think about how the taking the test could be challenging, and people are dealing with other challenges in life. It makes people feel responsible for things, which students passing tests or failing tests, one part of it is them working hard, but there's also a lot of other factors that go into that. And the grit discourse tends to ignore those other factors and just focus on be a strong individual.
Chapter 9 on anger. Teach anger, or at least we should acknowledge anger for what it is. Can you further elaborate what you mean when it comes to a classroom context?
Yes. So I definitely agree that we should use anger in a useful way. So like the quote from Bell Hooks, I really like. Um, and for me, this is something very different from being not angry. So to use the anger. So on the one hand, we could talk about accepting the anger, seeing the anger, accepting it, and using it for something positive. And I want to make a distinction between that and being not angry. And I'm focused on this because this is related to an argument made recently by Martha Nussbaum. And she talks about Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, and Mahatma Gandhi, who are all leaders who faced horrific oppression in different historical moments, and they're well known for being leaders who got through those challenges. Martha Nussbaum says that they were successful because they weren't angry. And this is something that Martha Nussbaum's not responsible for this, but in schools, people tell the story about Martin Luther King Jr. And they emphasize that he's always peaceful. He's never angry. He always has a positive spirit. Same thing with Nelson Mandela. The picture's painted that this person was always smiling. He was afraid of a rebellion at the end of apartheid, but he was just nice to everyone. He wasn't angry about apartheid or going to jail. So this story is told, but I just think this is way too simplified. Martin Luther King talked about having anger and using anger. And sometimes he was angry, and he wrote, he did make speeches where he said, yes, people are angry. Let's use that anger. He never said stop being angry. Nelson Mandela has discussed a lot the anger that he has faced and the way that he's used it. So my concern is that if we have a very one-sided view that the answer is not ever to ever have any anger, if that's the lesson that we're teaching, this isn't realistic, and it's not as helpful as a slightly different message, which is simply that we see that anger and we try to do something good with it. So what Martha Nussbaum wants to say is that if people are too angry, at least I think this is what she wants to say, if people are too angry, then they're going to be irrational. So this is always the fear, is you're going to be irrational if you're too angry. But to me, that there's sort of three different paths. There's angry rage, psycho rage. Then there's just, I refuse to be angry no matter what. But I do see sort of a middle place where you have anger and you try to face that anger, and you understand that anger is a part of life, that people have anger. So I think it's really strange that students in school might be exposed to the idea that Martin Luther King Jr. never had anger. So, why should you be angry that you got punished because Martin Luther King Jr. was never angry? A very simple example, but I think, some anger is okay, and it's much more healthy to learn how to use it in your garden, how to sort of sublimate it, to transform its energy in different ways. That's the way Buddhists describe anger, and Buddhism again is another philosophy which is stereotyped as being cold, stoic, no anger, and there are different views. But a lot of people say the point, you can't actually get rid of all your anger. If you do, you might not be responding to a world where you should be angry sometimes. But the point is to really just take that anger and think about it and process it, and then do something positive with it.
That is really, and you really see, in the conclusion, how you really put this all together and how nicely you close it, as you just said. Um, you said that identities are complex and differ from person to person. Do you see any negative implication a concept such as white privilege might have, since the public discussion does often leave out critical distinction that you make in your work, and obviously as a professor, which is really distinctive work where you point out nuances,
Yeah, so this is really tricky issue, and quite a complicated thing to think about. So so I guess the ground for this discussion is why are people angry in society when there isn't anyone who did anything to them. So I made the simple example of the young person angry that they did badly in a test. They can't really blame anyone but themselves for that. But from a sociological viewpoint, for a scholar of sociology, we are living in these social organizations and structures, which are hidden from view from a certain perspective, but from their discipline, they study this, and they use empirical means to study this, how society, so for example, men are making more money than women in the same job with the same qualifications, and white people are making more than Black people, have more wealth than Black people. So how do we know? So there's sort of this joke in social justice discourse, and sometimes I make a joke like I'm just angry at the capitalist patriarchy, white supremacy, because we know there's these overarching things that make an impact on our lives, where our identities are impacted by these factors, which are not our fault. It's not my fault that I'm present as a white woman in this scheme of things. So the problem is, who are we actually angry at? And one reason why people say you shouldn't be angry is, like you mentioned before, there could be a scapegoating. Like it's not white men's fault, right? That doesn't really make sense, and it doesn't really solve the problem. But on the other hand, people should be angry that society is not fair. So it doesn't make sense to be angry at a group of people, but that doesn't make it the case that anger is ungrounded or useless just because the problems are complicated. So you can still think, okay, I'm angry about social injustice and inequality. I'm angry that a school for poor Black kids in the city has less resources than another school. I'm angry about that. You don't have to say, I'm angry at that group or it's that group's fault or problem. But you could maybe use that anger to do something positive. So again, it is tricky arguments, but I think anger is still valuable there. And that's what makes it tricky, is because there's no one to be angry at. So this makes people feel irrational, and people are told it's irrational if you're not angry at someone. But just like we feel happiness or gratitude, we don't always feel that at someone. So that's the nature of emotions, is sometimes we feel them and it's not directly related to a cause. So they're not always rational, despite us wanting them to be rational. So this is a great example of that as well.
We need to learn to work through emotions, even if they are negative, also in schools. In other words, they are seen as impediment to teaching and learning. Therefore, they are mostly ignored or seen as distracting. For example, it can be a vessel to communicate what is dear to someone, as you give very nicely the example, to show that what you love or have lost, and it can just be a way of communicating your admiration or your gratitude, let's say. Can you further elaborate how this could unfold within a classroom setting?
Yeah, so this is a really hard case. So the first part of the book, I think about emotions which are constantly promoted in education: happiness, caring, gratitude. And then at the end, I start thinking, what are we saying not to do? So we're saying not to have anger. But I think for fear and grief and anxiety and sadness, these are the hard cases, because societies don't deal with these things well. I was going to say our society. I'm not sure. There hasn't been a lot of research on this issue in relation to education. But I think it's the case that in Western societies, no one really knows how to deal with grief. And we're talking about this more today with COVID. We're seeing this around the world, that people are experiencing death directly or indirectly, and psychologists will say there should be some grieving process, but we don't know how to do this. And it's an interesting educational issue. So So happiness in education, many people talked about that before me, but actually people aren't really discussing this issue of sadness in education. And I think the first thing that I would think of here is that it's a lot for teachers to take on. And I think one of the underlying threads of this book is we tend to be imagining that teachers are like therapists or counselors when we talk about education for well-being. It's a lot for them to take on when you think about the cross-cultural, the political dimensions, and then of course, most of them are supposed to be teaching math or English. They're not supposed to be teaching emotional well-being in the first place. So this is a lot for teachers to take on, but my main point here is that these feelings are rational and healthy, and they have to be understood as such, and acknowledged as such. So they're not just the opposites of happiness, because I think sometimes they're seen as the opposites. They're not just detrimental to learning in subjects. So if students are dealing with grief because of loss of life, of something like that, the point isn't just stop being unhappy in order to study. And I think teachers in schools do know this, but I think this is something that we're going to have to continue dealing with in the future and dealing with more constructively, as an example of an important feeling that's worth acknowledging in education. And if we don't acknowledge it too, young people can learn the lesson that it must be bad if their teacher's not acknowledging it. So here, I don't think that there needs to be a complicated curriculum or some in-depth counseling or therapy conducted by teachers, but I think it is worth acknowledging what we call negative emotions in education, that they're still there, and it's better to acknowledge them and to let students know that they're okay if they feel them, because it could be really bad if students learn the lesson that it's not okay.
And it's also really, in that sense, so important because it is a way how you can potentially really deeply connect with your students. And I think it's really through emotion and sharing them that we can, whether it's, in our social life or in our school. So I think this really made me reflect, how important and how fruitful it is and it will be in the future. So I'm very grateful for this. And again, you recognize we have to recognize the complexity of being human is really to query and complicate such emotions, to our advantage, and of course our students. Now, to sum up, emotions have become part of education, particularly for developing character and for social and emotional learning. You also conclude that there is little compelling evidence that increasing happiness, compassion, and gratitude through educational interventions leads to students feeling better, more moral, let alone improved prosocial behavior. If there are some observed, its sustainability is far from clear. Emotional virtue education is ultimately used as a tool to address classroom challenges. And this is really a main point I took away from this book. And how it is effective in internal development processes remains an open question, though. Changing the system or changing the actor, ultimately, you ask, when it comes to moral education.
So that's the main question that I ask, and I think it has to be a little bit of a combination of both. So this is a political book because I'm interested in the way that civic education has become more about individuals' good behavior, more about going back to Mandela, Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi, they organized with people around them to make positive changes. The world did not become a better place because of their emotional well-being. That's simply not true. But schools are kind of teaching that message that it was their emotional well-being. They're not explaining these people organized with other groups They educated other groups about their experience. They had consciousness raising where people compared their experiences and started problem solving. So that also needs to be part of emotional education. If you have an emotional challenge, you go to a therapist, they might tell you to just meditate or do yoga, but often they're going to encourage you reflect on your reality, reflect on what you can change about situations. So we need to have both of those things in the school. I think I mean, I am sympathetic to the virtue ethics view, and I think you know, especially after doing all this research on psychology and virtue ethics, I'm mindful, and I think I want to become a better person all the time. But becoming a better person isn't just about my feelings, and I can't always control my feelings. And sometimes it's about saying, I don't like what's happening here, and I'm going to change what's happening in the world around me.
And as you say, it's really the problem is that moral and political questions are mostly ignored in today's way we educate emotion in schools. I hope I paraphrase you correctly. It is ultimately about studying good action, not just good feelings, as you just said, in order for schools to cultivate good moral and political beings and, as important, actors.
Yes, definitely.
As you mentioned, there is this kind of chicken egg question, and you recommend that any moral virtue education needs to be from inside out. In other words, it is beyond an individual emotional state towards an outward disposition that leads to reasoned moral action. Can you further elaborate what you precisely mean by this?
Yes, so the chicken and egg problem, this is something people discuss when it comes to how we intervene in the challenges that we face. So a few people have talked about this when it comes to virtues education. It's also discussed by Angela Duckworth when she defends her concept of grit. So when she defends her concept of grit, as one example, she says, it's chicken and egg problem because yes, we need to fix the world around us, um, but fixing the world around us also means to fix ourselves. So the question is, do we try to change the world or do we try to change ourselves? And people who are focused on grit or emotional virtues tend to focus on changing their self. And I think that they do this because they think it's easier and simpler. And I think that they believe I'm saying I think here because this is my interpretation because I don't really agree with them because I don't think that it's simpler. So I think that they believe that it's simpler, but I don't think it's simpler because, as I mentioned, I don't think that these interventions are working in a long-term way. I don't think that since we've been discussing this, people have become happier. And I don't think that since we've been discussing this and doing these interventions, which has been a few decades now, I don't see people can be happy and still be jerks. People can be caring for their friends and family and still be jerks to other people around them. So I don't see them as a chicken and eggs. So it's called the chicken and egg situation, but the problem is that the egg and the chick doesn't grow into the chicken. So I think that there's a reason to focus on both at the same time. Like I said, that we want to think outward and inward all the time and realize the relationship between the two. I think that that's what the leading psychologists would say is the healthiest thing. I think that's what the leading virtue ethicists would say is the most sensible and coherent and morally right thing. Somehow this just gets simplified in education and it becomes a political question of like fixing the students. And this is where the message is like the baby thrown out with the bathwater, and something else happens. Students are somehow just supposed to show that they feel good, and the politics, the civic engagement that's also part of the equation is taken out. Students aren't learning how to collaborate to solve problems or to solve problems as much as they're learning how to look happy and not look angry in their classes.
So it's really learning, how to live, and especially in a systemic, uh, thinking systemically, to live with a complex life and complex circumstances and be somehow, as you mentioned in the book, comfortable in being in a state of ambiguity when it comes to educating emotions.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, it's not easy for teachers, and we want to imagine that schools and teachers, that the point of all of that is to teach students the right answers. And the point here is that this teachers don't have the right answers. Teachers are humans too and have complicated emotions that they may or may not understand. And it's for this reason that we need to sort of, I think, open up more open dialogues that aren't too unbalanced. I mean, I think that's part of the one theme throughout the book is there's an unbalanced approach that's all about individuals and positive feelings, and we really need to be a bit more open and realistic about what the challenges we face are in a community space, rather than saying, okay, the goal is to be efficient and happy and constructive, to develop a more community sense of dealing with our problems together.
Liz Jackson, thank you so much for this wonderful book and your insight and your time.
Oh, well, thank you so much. It's a privilege to answer your questions. I'm so glad that you read it and found it interesting. And thanks for inviting me to do this interview. It was a lot of fun.
Professor Dr. Liz Jackson.